Depending on the complexity of your site, you may want to pop in a way for users to register and log in. By default, WordPress comes with its own login and registration forms, but they're very simple and not appealing at all. That's alright. WordPress can account for every situation out there. Luckily, this problem is solved by using third-party plugins. There are dozens and dozens of membership plugins out there. Originally, for this lecture, I was planning on recommending one and then installing it. Then I would walk you through on how to set it up. But there were two problems I encountered. The first problem was that the plugins were extremely bloated. Now don't get me wrong, the plugins we're already using have some bloat, but they're not so bloated that they drastically slow down the site because of the features we're not using. However, the membership plugins that were usable had thousands of lines of code that we weren't going to use, such as payment processing, custom fields, and so much more. The second problem was actually finding plugins that were extremely simple but were not developer friendly. These plugins had their own UIs, and it was too much trouble to make the UI match the theme on our site. A lot of them were outdated as well, so rather than using a third-party plugin, I thought this would be a great opportunity to show you how to do it yourself. Before we get started, I want to take the time to let you know that membership plugins are extremely beneficial for any theme. If you plan on selling your theme, then including a very featured-packed membership plugin wouldn't be so bad. I actually recommend it. However, for this theme we're creating, we only need something super simple. Alright, let's get started. Some of the steps we'll be taking isn't anything we haven't done before. We'll be using a shortcode to display the form and an AJAX request to process the information. We'll be working inside the recipe plugin rather than a custom one, just to save some time. Inside the main plugin file, call the add shortcode function. The name of the shortcode will be recipe auth form. The function to call is our recipe auth form shortcode. Create a file inside the includes /shortcodes called recipeauth.php. Define the function here and include it from the main plugin file. Next, create a file named recipeauth.template.php. This file will contain all the HTML for the form. Inside the Udemy theme folder, we actually have a template called auth.html. I'm going to open this up inside my browser. Here's what that looks like. We're basically going to try and recreate this page. If I open up this template and scroll down, you'll eventually find the HTML for the form. I'm going to copy these two columns and paste them into the shortcode template. After doing so, let's go back to the shortcode function. Just like before, we'll be creating a variable. I'm going to call it form.html, and its value will be the value returned by the function getFileContents, with the template in the first parameter and true as the second. Then I'll just return this HTML. Let's test this out now. I'm going to create a brand new page with the title My Account. The content will be just the shortcode recipe auth form. The template will be full width. Save the page and then view it. You should more or less have what I have on my screen. We can now begin authenticating the user. The very first thing we should do is make sure the form is secure for submission. There are various ways you can go about this, but WordPress provides a solution called Nonces. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to more information about this topic. Let's take a look at what WordPress has to say about nonces. A nonce is a number used once to help protect URLs and forms from certain types of misuse, malicious, or otherwise. WordPress nonces aren't numbers, but are a hash made up of numbers and letters. Nor are they used only once, but have a limited lifetime after which they expire. During that time period, the same nonce will be generated for a given user in a given context. The nonce for that action will remain the same for that user until that nonce lifecycle has completed. WordPress's security tokens are called nonces. Despite the above noted differences from true nonces, because they serve much the same purpose as nonces do. They help protect against several types of attacks, including cross-site forgery, but do not protect against replay attacks because they aren't checked for one-time uses. Nonces should never be relied on for authentication or authorization access control. Protect your functions using current user can. Always assume nonces can be compromised. So, as WordPress states, this helps you create a layer of security by using a token for verifying the form submission, but it's not completely foolproof. The rest of this documentation goes over how to use nonces. I suggest reading it fully after this lecture. Inside the template file, at the very top, I'm going to add a placeholder called noncefield.ph. Then, inside the shortcut function, I'm going to perform a simple string replace like we've always have. For the replacement, we'll be calling a function called wp_noncefield. This will take care of generating a nonce value while also creating an input field containing this value. In the resource section, I provide a link to this function. There are 4 parameters, which are all optional. The first one is always recommended though. The action name is a way to reference this field. You should set one as you'll need it to verify it later on. You'll see how this works in just a moment. For now, I'm going to set it to recipe auth. The next parameter is the name for the input field. By default, it's _wp_nonce. I'm going to set this to the default. The third parameter is whether to include a referrer. A referrer is the URL that the request was submitted on. It's going to make sure the form was submitted on this page and not through some other site. I'm going to set this as true. The fourth parameter determines whether this field should be outputted or returned. Set this to false, which will return rather than outputted. Let's verify that the fields are being generated and outputted by refreshing the page and checking the HTML. Using developer tools, you'll find these 2 hidden input fields appear right before forms. Traditionally, you'll want these fields to appear inside the form, but we won't concern ourselves with that since we'll be using jQuery and Ajax to submit the form. Open up the main.js file. This is the same file that contains the rating code. We'll be working inside this file for all our JavaScript needs. Once again, I'll be using the on method for listening to a form submission and preventing the default behavior. We have this div with an ID of register status. I'm going to modify its HTML contents and let the user know their account is being created. Then I'll just hide the form to prevent resubmission. Next, I'm going to create the form object like before. The action will be recipe create account. The other 5 values would just be the form's input fields. The last property I want to create will be called _wp_nonce. It's important you name it this, as WordPress will be expecting this field when verifying the nonce. The value will be grabbed from the hidden input field. The last thing I want to do is make a jQuery post request. It's the exact same way as we did before, except I'm going to use promises. The always method behaves similar to the previous way we did it. It'll accept a function where the response is passed into it. Just like last time, we'll check the status property and display an appropriate message to the end user. If the registration was a success, we'll just let the user know they can register. Otherwise, we'll tell them it was a failure and display the form again. Nothing new so far. It's pretty simple stuff. Inside the main plugin file, I'm going to use the WP Ajax no-priv hook. This is important. Users who are not logged in should only be able to create accounts. This function will use the same name as the dynamic hook. Inside the process folder, create a file named createaccount.php and define the function here. Make sure to include it from the main plugin file. Inside this function, I'm going to create the output array with a status key and its value being 1. Immediately afterwards, I'm going to grab the WP nonce field and store it in a variable called nonce. I'm going to check if it's available by using a PHP ternary operator. If it's set, I'll set this variable to the field. Otherwise, I'll just set it to an empty string. Next, inside a conditional statement, I'm going to use a function called WP verify nonce. This function will take any nonce we were given and the name of the action. If we go back to the shortcut function, you'll see we named it recipe auth. Pass that in as a string into this function. If the function returns false, then we want to kill the script with the output like we always do. I'm going to create an additional conditional statement to check if the rest of the post variables were set. If any of them weren't, then I'll just kill the script. After performing these simple checks, let's create variables for each of the post values. I'm going to sanitize each value with the sanitize text field function. The email will be sanitized with the sanitize email function. It works like the sanitize text field function, except it's for emails. With the data being set, I'm going to use another conditional statement and perform quite a few checks. I'll be using the username exists and email exists functions to check if the username or email is already in use. These functions are provided by WordPress and will make the necessary SQL queries to check if these two values are taken. While I'm performing these checks, I'll check if the two passwords match, and I'll check if the email being submitted is a valid email using the isEmail function. The isEmail function is another WordPress function that helps with verifying an email and its format. Be sure to check this conditional statement twice. Make sure your code matches mine. Pause the video if you need to. If any of these checks pass, I'm going to kill the script again. If the user has made it this far, then we'll begin by creating the user. There are two functions available for doing this, the WP create user and WP insert user functions. Both of them do the exact same thing. The WP create user is actually a wrapper and a more simplified version of the WP insert user function. This may seem appealing, but it won't do for our purposes. I want to set more values than this function will allow, so we'll be using the WP insert user function. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to this function. As you can see, this function accepts an array of fields we can set. We won't be setting all of these, only the ones the user has submitted. Let's use this function now. This function will return an ID if successful. I want to save this ID for future use, so create a variable named userID and assign its value to this function. Pass an array and set the following fields. User login will be set to the username. User pass will be set to pass. We're passing this in as plain text, but you don't have to worry. WordPress will take the time to salt and hash this password for you before inserting it into the database. User email will be set to the email. User nice name will be set to the name. The nice name is used to display a more friendly name to users rather than displaying the username. That's all I need to do to create a user. If we take a look at the documentation, you'll see a list of possible return values. Here is what WordPress says about the possible return values. If successful, returns the newly created user's user ID. If query fails, returns a WP error object. If the user login is longer than 60 characters, returns a WP error object. If user nice name is longer than 50 characters, returns a WP error object. So if this fails, we can definitely expect a WP error object. I'm going to create a conditional statement and use the isWPError function to help us identify if the value returned is an error object. If this returns true, then I want to kill the script and let the user know the registration was a failure. Now that the user has been created, we only have a few more things to do. The next step is totally optional, but I like to automatically log in the user after creating their account. To log the user in, we need to grab the user object. I'm going to create a new variable named user and assign its value to the value returned by the function getUserBy. This function will return a user object. It allows you to grab a user with numerous fields and values. Since we have the user ID, we'll just use that. The first parameter will be a string ID. To specify, we want to grab the user by their ID. The second parameter will be the ID itself. This should return the user and all their properties. To log in a user, there are a couple of things we need to do. First, we need to let WordPress know about the current user. This will not authenticate the user, but simply tell WordPress that the user is now active within the system. Call the wp-set-current-user function and pass in the user ID along with the user login. Next, I want to set up a cookie so WordPress will remember this user for future use. Call the function wp-set-auth-cookie and pass in the user ID. This function has a second parameter which will remember the user even if they exit out the browser. By default, this is false, which is what we want. The reason I want this is because the user may be registering on an insecure location. This cookie will only be active until the user exits out their browser. Next, I want to set up a hook using the doAction function. The hook I want to run is called wp-login, and I'm going to pass in 2 extra arguments. I'm going to pass in the ID and the user object. This hook will allow WordPress itself to run any authentication settings and will allow for any other plugins to perform any setups when a user is logged in. After doing all of this, the user is now logged in. Before I move on, I want to inform you about a function called wp-sign-on that does all this for us, but the reason we didn't use it is because it brings back mixed results upon first login. When a user logs in for the first time, there is additional setup that WordPress and additional plugins want to do. By doing it this way, we make it easier to let those plugins do so. What I just showed you is a more definite way to log in a user for the first time. To end this function, I'm going to update the output status key to 2, and then I will kill the script. This will let the script know the user has successfully created an account. We're almost done with the registration. Since the user is logged in after registering, then we should redirect them to the home page so they don't have to stare at this page. Inside the front/enqueue function, I'm going to create another local variable named HomeURL and set its value returned by the function HomeURL. Pass in a simple / to let this function know that you want the URL to the root page itself. We can now use this variable inside our script. Right after the status message, set the href property of the location object to the new localized property like so. You can now test this form. Make sure you are logged out or this form will not work. Try testing this form with invalid info. Then try testing it with valid info. You should see a success message for a brief moment, and then be redirected to the home page. You should also notice that you are now logged back in by WordPress. This is exactly what we wanted. I'm going to log out again and navigate back to this page. In the next lecture, we will work on making the login form work. It's very similar to what we did with the registration form.